The views and opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Natural Bridges Media or KSQD's staff, volunteers, or underwriters.
Hello and welcome to Talk of the Bay. I'm your host, Len B.A. And with me today is Kieren Rudge. Kieren is a doctoral student in the Society and Environment Division of the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management at UC Berkeley. Their research interests lie at the intersection of climate justice, critical race theory, and decolonization studies. Before coming to UC Berkeley, Kieren researched climate policy planning and discourse across various geographies within the continental United States, as well as in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Currently, they are focused on analyzing how systems of climate change adaptation may reproduce military colonial power structures and environmental injustice in Pacific Islands. In particular, they are studying how these systems are impacting communities in the territory of Guam, considering how political status impacts self-determination of indigenous peoples with regard to climate action. Kieren has a Master in Environmental Science from Yale, a Bachelor's in Environmental Science from Johns Hopkins University, and their research has been published in Nature Climate Change, Urban Climate, and Climate Risk Management. Kieren Rudge, welcome to Talk of the Bay.
Thanks, Len. Really glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you for joining us from afar. I know it's always a little different when you're trying to do these things in the virtual world. You've covered a lot of ground in your work and your research, but I want to start with talking about climate change adaptation. More and more we're dealing with adaptation not just in public discourse, but in policy, how we prepare for and adapt to increasing risk of catastrophic fires or floods, hurricanes or drought, and how we'll be forced to deal with crop loss and sea level rise and tropical diseases expanding into temperate zones, among other issues. You've been looking at adaptation through the lens of justice and equity. Could you tell us what inspired your inquiry into this topic?
Yes, definitely. So I think for adaptation specifically, it is a few decades ago when people were thinking about climate change on the international stage at places like the forums that the UN put on and in science and research as well. For a long time, it was kind of put to a side as something that we don't want to think about. We want to think about mitigating emissions first and foremost, and we want to think about preventing global warming from happening. But unfortunately, now the impacts of climate change are very real. They have been happening in places across the world very tangibly, and they're not just something that can be completely prevented. Impacts that we in many different communities have to deal with head on and adapt to it. So for me, I really got interested in working in climate justice and adaptation through thinking about justice first and foremost. So I was really interested in thinking about accessibility and equity in urban planning. So the environments in cities be really equitable, having green spaces in low-income neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color, not just in more affluent areas, and things like adequate protections for sea level rise and hurricanes across different spaces. So that's really what motivates me, is thinking about, yes, we need to adapt, but also when adaptation is taking place in such a way where there's not this inequity that keeps happening. If we do adaptation in such a way where we try to do a blanket adaptation policy that treats as the same, or even prioritizes the wealthier places where our economic centers might already be, if we're doing that without a very specific justice lens, might be able to happen, but it's not going to happen in a way that is good for everyone and is good for justice more broadly. So that's really why I'm motivated to think about justice and adaptation, because solving climate change is a massive problem in and of itself. And it would be very dangerous and unjust if we put a lot of into adapting without considering inequities.
Yeah, it's been pretty widely acknowledged that climate change itself is deepening inequities in society, in the sense that, well, particularly poor countries are suffering from the consequences sooner and to greater extent than the industrialized nations that have contributed the most in terms of emissions. But that's also true in, poor neighborhoods where we have, the neighborhoods that happen to be next to refineries and chemical plants that are using fossil fuels as their feedstocks, the neighborhoods that are near, oil fields and gas fields and coal mines and all the rest. It's the impacts are much greater for those communities. Could you talk about are some particular examples that you're familiar with about how that inequity is going on now and how that fits into a lens of climate justice?
Yeah, so of course. So I think you have a lot of really important there. Often when we think about global injustice and climate change, there might be a narrative where the United States and Western European countries are emitting the most, and global South countries like small islands or developing states are emitting much less and having a lot more impact. So there's a disproportionate impact related to the amount of emissions happening. And that's very much true, that these more wealthy Western, generally, nations have emitted more and on average are feeling less impacts. But then something that you noted, which is important to recognize as well, is that within each diversity still, and there's still inequality. So it's really important to unpack that and be like thinking that the United States, for example, is not a monolith, and even individual cities are not a monolith. So work was focusing on New York City, and I grew up in the suburbs in New York and have worked there. One of the organizations that I've worked with is called We Act for Environmental Justice. And they so in northern Manhattan. And they are really doing incredible work about climate justice, which has stemmed from their work about environmental justice more broadly. So this is a group that was fighting back against waste treatment plants in their neighborhood, even in the 80s and 90s, and really pushing for all these environmental harms to be taken out of their neighborhood, which is predominantly Black and Latin income. And so they've been facing these environmental harms where the city really was not addressing equity and was really enabling these harms to go mostly to these marginalized neighborhoods. It comes in now is that as climate change has become such a big problem, it's really falling in line and repeating these patterns of environmental injustice that were happening before. So now Manhattan versus the more wealthy parts of Manhattan, even like the Upper West Side, Upper East Side, and then getting to where all the economic centers are and businesses are downtown. In northern Manhattan, is going to be a lot less green space, for example. And what that does with regard to climate change is it relates to urban heat and extreme heat waves. So for entire city of New York is facing a heat wave that is going to be a climate impact that harms everyone to an extent. But if we zoom in on neighborhood levels, we can see that communities of color and lower income communities are going to feel those heat waves more intensely. And this is not just a small change in temperature. This can actually lead to deaths, particularly for people who are older. And it can also lead to higher burden on people's electricity costs if people are having to run ACs, or they might not be able to afford ACs, so they have to deal with that heat and deal with it. So I think that is really indicative of something that has happened across cities, across America, across the world, is there are these neighborhood to neighborhood disparities that go back to all these urban for decades and centuries, that now as climate change is coming in, it is recreating these inequalities that were already laid out by these urban planning.
Yeah, and we're broadcasting here in Central Coast, and while the coastal neighborhoods, within a mile or so of the ocean, tend to have the temperatures mitigated, we do get extreme heat in the inland valleys, and Salinas Valley is a great example. And we find that the people most at risk here when we do have heat waves are typically the agricultural workers in the Salinas Valley. And of course, these are the people who are, at the bottom of the earning scale, and also oftentimes live in the neighborhoods where there is, a lack of air conditioning. There's a lack of, park space, where there's some natural cooling from trees and shade. So it seems like that pattern is repeating, in different regions of the country for different, geographies, but definitely a pattern. So in terms of framing this, like you said, this kind of the idea of climate justice arising out of environmental justice, you've talked a lot about how our framework, kind of the paradigms of race and of political status are to some degree shaping the policies towards not just climate, trying to mitigate climate change, but particularly to adapt to it. And I wondered if you could go into that, like what is that framework that you're talking about that we might not be even aware or conscious of, that's playing a role in particularly in the halls of government when they're formulating policy?
Yeah, certainly to unpack with regard to these underlying structures that inform a lot of what happens with regard to our environments, with planning, with adaptation. So I've really been trying to focus on more is thinking about how are these underlying legal structures or policies on a federal level impacting people's ability or what happens in their communities. So that's really a big aspect as well. So beyond just the distribution of where impacts are or where harms are, there's also this big procedural justice component where the systems that are set up to plan for climate change, designed to hear out diverse voices, are they designed in such a way where only expert scientists have a say or only senators have a say? And is there consideration for these inequities? Like, does a marginalized group that might have a minority vote in a district have a say, or is their specific climate change priorities being ignored? And so thinking about that on a pretty large scale, my work that's focusing on the US territories, this is something that is for any of the political decision making that happens. So in the territories, I've been trying to do a lot more work in Guam, and you can see a lot of these parallel events happening. There have been a lot of incidents of hurricanes. So in Puerto Rico, Hurricane Irma and Maria had huge impacts that downed the electrical grid for a long time and cut off beyond the island of Puerto Rico. In Guam, it's very similar. Recently, they had a large typhoon, one of the most intense typhoons in a long time, Typhoon Mawar. And it destroyed this electrical grid, really cutting off again supply lines that are connecting these islands to the rest of the continental US. And the reason that political status is in that is because the federal relationship with the US territories is set up in a way that I argue is inequitable for that procedural aspect for communities and the local government in these territories to control their adaptation processes and their self-sufficiency more broadly. So for example, with Typhoon Mawar or with Hurricane Irma and Maria in Puerto Rico, there were a lot of issues with being able to get food and other forms of aid shipped in a timely manner. And one of that delay and those restrictions is this old federal policy, the Jones Act of 1920, where there are restrictions that were set up to protect the US shipping industry back then, such that full of shipping from one US port to another is restricted to just US ships and a lot of other restrictions. And for the territories, there's a lot more legal complexity with it, but next is that they might not be able to get aid from other countries that are very nearby them, like other islands, or for the case of the Pacific territories, they might not be able to get aid legally for Eastern Asian countries as easily as they can get it from California or Hawaii, which are farther away. So that's one example of these policies that are set up control the relationship between the federal government and the territories, where climate change wasn't a factor when they were created. And now climate change again is causing quality and exacerbating these impacts based on this existing legal structure that was a little unequal. And that can play out in cities in the continental style, just with the structures of how property moved around in the colonial period or in the period of Reconstruction, the periods of, so throughout all these time periods, there was a lot of discriminatory land practices, right? We all know about the segregation and the discrimination that was going on. And that still has a very important lingering impact that has dictated where communities of different racial groups live. And oftentimes, particularly in the American South, for example, the communities of color that were pushed away from certain areas that might have been like higher away from rivers and things like that, and pushed into that are more vulnerable. So there's some cases of that happening in South Carolina, for example. And that's really tied to these racialized histories where if you look back at the history, there are documented cases, powerful white business people forcing out these Black communities. So there are these really old legacies that are still lingering that inform property and land and where people live comes in. It's not happening in a vacuum. It is impacting people and relating to all these existing inequalities.
If you're just tuning in to Talk of the Bay here at KSQD, my guest is Kieren Rudge. Kieren Rudge is a doctoral student in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management at UC Berkeley, who has been doing a lot of research on the environmental justice issues around climate change and particularly climate adaptation. You talked about the issue with the territories, and of course, I mean, they're at a clear power disadvantage, in fact, in the sense that they don't have statehood, so they don't have the autonomy that states have to make local decisions. And further, they don't have elected representatives in Congress at all. But you mentioned procedural justice, and I wonder if you could explain that more for us.
So, thinking about environmental justice, there are a few different components that are really big parts. And the ones that I think about the most are distributive justice, which is where are and where environmental goods are and like who's feeling that, right? So which communities are getting the benefits, which communities are getting the harms. It's the distribution. Procedural justice, really about decision making. So are the processes that are set up to make decisions equitable? Are they inclusive of diverse voices? And as you brought up, issues with that. So in the 5 U.S. territories, there are different nuances between them in terms of their political relationships to the United States. All 5 elected representatives that they send to the House of Representatives, but that person doesn't get to vote on the floor. So each of them have a representative who can be there and try to add interests of their electorate, but that person is not allowed to vote when it comes down to it. And none of the territories has representation in the US Senate, even with a non-voting member. Beyond that, there's also issues with protections under the Constitution. So generally, residents of US territories are US citizens, with the exception of residents of American Samoa. People are by default given the status of a US national. And there's a lot of this nuance, again, like I was saying, but what ends up happening is that even as a citizen in a territory, constitutional guarantees and protections, as opposed to being a US citizen in one of the continental states. And another impact that, another important point I think is there's definitely a lot of different opinions from folks who live in territories over what their political relationship with the United States should be. So many people are accepting of the current political status. And then beyond that, in terms of making change, there are a few different options. So there is statehood, which is often the most talked about. I would say, every few years we go going to become a state. And we know what that looks like. We know what a state might be. And there is a lot, again, the people who live there might get more protections under the Constitution. They might have easier access to the continental states. It might break down a lot of these structural supply chain issues that I talked about. So statehood's definitely an option, and that has some procedural benefits because there's more repress. That's where a lot of decisions are made over climate change and everything else. Another path forward that people across different territories are working on is thinking about independence. So advocating for, rather than becoming a state and strengthening the relationship with the United States, people might want an independent nation in itself. And that comes with its own benefits as well. If you're an independent country and not a territory, there's not this federal power that is hundreds of miles away from you that is making decisions. Like you were saying, there's a lot of restrictions, decision making on the local happenings as a territory, where if a territory becomes an independent country, there's more agency. Something that would be beneficial in is that right now as territories, there is often a lack of access to federal programs that states might get. So, for example, with FEMA to hurricanes and other emergencies that are nowadays often related to climate change, in the territories, there's often not as much of a guarantee that FEMA funding will come through. And recent administration has passed things mainly through executive orders to say, okay, the territories are going to get some of this support from FEMA, but it's a little precarious. It could go away. It's not guaranteed as it is to the states. So to be able to access that adaptation resource as consistently. And on the other hand, they are also not able to access a lot of international adaptation financing that independent countries might be able to get. So another small island developing state may be able to get access to UN Green Bank funded climate change adaptation projects, whereas a US territory is not going to be able to access that support because they are a part of the US. They can't access that as a developing independent. So these are all these procedural questions that we're thinking not just about how decisions are made in terms of actual within planning agencies, how are decisions made, and representatives having productive town halls and listening to their electorate. That's a part of it. Are the representatives hearing out voices? But then there's also these structural, legal, political that are constraining procedural justice. So no matter how inclusive the elected representative of Guam, for example, is trying to be of hearing diverse voices in his community, the structure of the territory makes it such that that procedural justice is limited still because there's a non-voting representative legal structure. So there's all these considerations that go into these procedural aspects on multiple scales.
Yeah, and just another layer there in the territories, because it's not it's even one step further removed from what I'd call direct or local democracy. Well, we're going to take a really short break. We'll be right back with more with Kieren Rudge right after this. Don't touch that dial. And welcome back to Talk of the Bay. I'm your host, Len B.A., and my guest today is Kieren Rudge. Kieren's a doctoral student in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management at UC Berkeley, and has been doing research on the intersection of climate justice, critical race theory, and decolonization. Kieren, when we talk about climate adaptation, it's often with a bias towards like reinforcing the infrastructure. We'll build higher seawalls, or we'll find some technological fix of some kind. How do you see adaptation with the framework of equity and justice?
Yeah, so that is a really great question, because a lot of the adaptation decision making, again, historically, less so now. I think it's moving away from this, but historically has really focused on these technical solutions and these science-driven solutions. Climate change, we need to understand the science, and we need to make evidence-based solutions for it. And we're not going to be able to mitigate emissions or adapt without technology of some sort. But often that becomes where all the money goes and all the focus goes is, how can we engineer our way out of this problem? And that manifests itself through projects like seawall, hard infrastructure, or it manifests itself through thinking about smart grids, for example. All of these things can be really beneficial using technology to adapt to climate change. But what gets lost often or pushed to the side is these sort of social solutions or culturally informed solutions that are still technical, but are using very specific cultural competencies to be appropriate for that community and that environment and the specific impacts that are going to be facing there. So this is really a big justice concern, because when the community perspectives, when the cultural competency, when the social resilience gets de-emphasized and the technical solutions get emphasized, it's again, the decision making is often going to be done by just physical peers, by urban planners that might not be consulting as much with communities. Because when we're driving technical solutions, we have to give most of the power to technical experts, and those people, they're experts in their technology and their engineering. So they're being brought in to focus on those solutions. So something with seawalls, for example, is going through this framework of, we are trying to engineer this barrier between communities that are vulnerable to sea level rise or to hurricanes. We're trying to build this barrier between communities and the harm that's going on the other side of the wall. And we can see, though, that these hard infrastructure measures often really fall short of addressing. They are inflexible. They're able to deal with a certain amount of sea level rise, but often they actually might make a very extreme hurricane or other storm. So before climate change adaptation was a big focus, we can see this example playing out with Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, with levees are assigned to a seawall that is hard infrastructure, and it keeps water out to a certain extent. But as soon as the water goes over that, it makes it more catastrophic, because then everything's rushing in.
The water in.
It's causing all this devastation. And then a solution that goes along with that is, now people are often thinking about nature-based solutions. So seawalls might also, can we think about these natural barriers that existed before we developed our cities? So in the Bay, there's a lot of great restoration going with the salt marshes, trying to get these systems. In lots of different coastal places, they are trying to restore natural coral reefs or natural mangrove forests, or even reefs that are predominantly from oysters, other kind of natural plants and animals. And so if we're thinking about restoring those ecosystems, as opposed to building a hard seawall, that actually does a lot for dissipating wave energy, these extreme hurricanes and storms, in a way that is not a solely physical engineering solution. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of urban planners and climate change adaptation professionals are based solutions a lot now. And those can also have great justice benefits, because often those solutions will restore ecosystems to what they were a lot of economic development, and even before a lot of colonial settlement and colonization of cities, of indigenous communities and their environment. If we're thinking about nature-based solutions that aim to adapt to climate change and support those native ecosystems, that can have a lot of great benefits for enabling people to have their livelihoods maintained. So communities that might be dependent on fisheries, communities that might be dependent on oysters, these sorts of things can be really beneficial as well, because these ecosystems to be healthy. So having barriers like a seawall might be addressing one component, but not all these other components about how do people interact with the coast? What are the cultural benefit type of fishing and these ways of interacting with the environment, which are also super valuable things to consider. We want to adapt to climate change, and we want to also be able to preserve these cultural practices too.
Yeah, and you in a recent article you wrote, you made reference to colonialism and justice and indigenous knowledge in regard to adaptation. And when you talk about these nature-based solutions or mitigation measures, does some of that come from indigenous knowledge?
Yeah, I would. It does. So there's a lot of really great people who work on this. There are a lot of great indigenous scholars who are researchers and scholars, and also work with their other communities, and they have produced a lot of great work to show how some of this indigenous knowledge that has existed for a very, very, very long time has always been about reciprocal relationships with the environment. So having a relationship with nature that is less extractive and less about dividing people from nature have benefits for maintaining healthy ecosystems, because you're trying to create solutions that are supporting this system where people are interacting with nature, people are trying to more harmonious relationships, as opposed to being focused on economic development and extraction. So often some indigenous knowledge systems are able to push back against this extraction. And a lot of people will argue in these sort of indigenous climate change adaptation frameworks, these things are things that were really marginalized by processes of colonialism and even processes of capitalism that focused on this extraction, that focused on treating the environment. It comes out through American property law, that comes out through how we are developing our resource-based economies. So when thinking about knowledge in terms of adaptation, there can be a lot of benefits to rethinking the rights of nature, for example. So in the States, there are indigenous communities that are really thinking about, okay, how can the rivers be protected? How can the forests be protected? And treating them not just as these resources to be managed, treating them physically valuable in their own right. In New Zealand, Aotearoa, there's even been movement to designate a river as essentially in a legal sense. So giving personhood to nature is something that has been talked about and implemented in various countries. And that has a lot of implications too, right? So if there is a river or a tree or a forest, that might afford different protections in bringing legal suits, or that might afford different protections in terms of preventing development and harm to that ecosystem. So I think that that's a big part of adaptation, thinking about knowledge beyond just our main Western science. How can we think about incorporating these different understandings of the environments around us, of climatic change? Something that's been really interesting is even thinking about archaeology. There are archaeologists who have done studies are showing, even historically, when we're thinking about natural climate changes that did happen with ice ages and things like that, there were these indigenous communities that were adapting, and you can see the archaeology changing where their settlements were based on the changes in temperature and ice and river levels. And they're changing how they're dealing with their land and how their environment. So I think that's a really important piece too, is that yes, climate change that's happening right now is different. It's man-made. It is happening extremely fast, and it is a result of that people did deliberately. But there have been these examples throughout history of indigenous communities and other communities dealing with change in their environment. And science and the technical solutions are deeply important. And also, we have to be looking towards these histories of people have been dealing with environmental change forever. And okay, if we're trying to adapt in this specific ecosystem, like here in the Bay, there's something to be said about thinking about the specific used by the Ohlone, for example, to adapt to environmental change here, to deal with fires here. And that knowledge really has to be valued just as much as knowledge has to be, particularly when you're thinking about a specific place and the specific indigenous knowledge that was going on there, and thinking not about indigenous knowledge as a monolith, because there's so many different diverse perspectives. It varies so much from community to community and place to place.
Yeah. I mean, that would be a contradiction in terms to think of indigenous knowledge as generic, because by the very definition of the word indigenous, it means pertaining to a place. And so the particulars of that place are going to apply. If you've just tuned in recently, my guest is Kieren Rudge, and we are talking about climate change, climate adaptation from a justice framework. Kieren, when you spoke at a conference here in Santa Cruz back in October, you talked about critical race theory as a useful framework for understanding about climate change adaptation and where it's succeeding, where it's failing, and what that adaptation would really require. And there's so much media hype about critical race theory. I wonder if you could start by just clarifying what's meant by that.
To start with, what is critical race theory? It's like you say, it gets really distorted in the media on different sides of the political spectrum. The far right side, often critical race theory is this phrase that is the boogeyman that represents wokeness and any sort of progressive changes that are attacks on American values or are reverse racism against white people. So critical race theory gets talked about a lot in that sense, is just this lightning rod, this boogeyman of racism. And what it really is a pretty specific framework developed out of legal scholarship in particular. So decades ago, we're really developing this theory out of what was previously called critical legal studies. So that field still is existing, and then critical race theories developed out of that. And really the main thing, a framework and often kind of like a method of looking at things. So it is a framework of looking at our legal system, and now we can look at a lot of different systems as well. People have used it to do system and other structures, and acknowledging the role that race is playing in it, and the role that the legal system has in reproducing means and reproducing marginalization along these lines. And so when we're thinking about critical race theory, it's really thinking about that. It's thinking about racialization, the law doing that. And then we can extend that to think about, okay, we want to think about these underlying legal structures. We want to think about these policies. And even if they make explicitly, if we zoom in on them and we historicize them, we can see, okay, what is this building off of? And if the underlying was built in such a way that it was racist, it was creating racial differentiation. If that underlying structure is built on racism, then laws and policies that are building upon that don't mention race explicitly, there are still these impacts that are happening. And so that's really, I think, the core to what critical race theory is. It's let's dig deeper. It's not about just saying, oh, okay, this person is racist or this policy specifically is explicitly racist. It's about looking under the surface and showing how these structures are. So, for example, when thinking about that as it applies to the territories again, there are these old legal cases called the insular cases. There are a series of cases from early on in the first decade of the 1900s that are addressing what's going on in the newly acquired US territory. And what happened in them is essentially there's these cases where people in Puerto Rico and Guam and the other territories are trying to have their rights exercised under the Constitution. And in the US Supreme Court, were essentially that the Constitution doesn't apply to the fullest extent in the territories because the peoples that live there are alien race, are so fundamentally different from the Western Anglo-American way of living that they cannot be incorporated into the United States. So those are some of these fundamental cases that are clearly racist. They're saying these are alien races. These people are fundamentally incompatible with America at this time until then. And those cases have basically never been overturned. And so now when we're building more policies and laws over the past century based off those foundations, this really obvious but hidden racist structure. And even nowadays, when communities are petitioning for like better rebel government or petitioning for more clear protections under the Constitution, some of the courts will still cite these really old, clearly racist cases because they've never been overturned. And that's just the precedent that's been set in our legal system. So until those are overturned, there is fundamentally going to be this inequitable racist relationship. And so we want to bring that conversation in to the climate change adaptation world and to climate change in general, is that we need to think about, if we want justice, if we want adaptation to happen in a way that's beneficial to a lot of people, to diverse, marginalized groups of people, then we can't do adaptation that ignores in those legal histories and other fundamental structures that have created these inequalities. If you're ignoring those structures, then you are essentially empowering them to going. If you're not overturning these cases, right, then you are saying they're valid. So that's really what critical race theory comes down to, is thinking about those underlying structures. And then how does that impact procedural justice?
Right. Yeah, and you wrote in one of your articles, actions that address climate change can either perpetuate unjust power relationships or deconstruct them. And you did a bunch of research about New York's planning process for climate adaptation and how, like every city in the United States, it nominally has a public participation process. But you were looking at how that public participation process, by virtue of the way it was set up, didn't really work for everybody. It kind of tended to give more voice to certain interests and to exclude other people. And so I wonder if you could talk about not only what you see in terms of that public participation process, but how it could be changed so that it really does work for people to fully, to have like equal participation in that public input to the planning process.
Yeah, definitely. And there's really a few levels going on again, right? So there's these planning processes, and then there's the underlying structures too. So I think what the planning processes first that come up are in the New York study, and it's been shown in other cities and other places, there's just this lack of awareness of public planning. So, how much effort and how many have to communicate to the impacted communities, the relevant communities, how much time and resources do they have to really get this message across? It's like, hey, this is something we think might find important, and you can give input. So just that component is huge, the awareness component. And another component is people's times, right? So generally people, they often have their childcare obligations. So that's a big thing that a lot of cities have tried to do, a lot of urban planners have tried to do, is we need to incorporate like childcare into our urban planning meetings, or incorporate, because they're missing dinner. So just simple things like that is like thinking about how people can actually participate in a way that it doesn't disrupt their whole week, because it is a form of, you need to be proactive as a citizen and, kind of be an activist to get engaged in these things. But it should also be accessible to people who don't have a ton of time and a ton of, right? They should still have the right to have a say in what's going on in planning. One thing that a lot of the research has found that I was looking at is how community-based organizations, so local nonprofits, how they can serve as sort of a conduit, as an intermediary between the local government and between their communities. And there's a lot of work that shows just how, if a community-based organization has a good relationship with the government, that will be really beneficial, because these organizations often have a good understanding of the challenges and the priorities of people who live in their community. And if the government is able to tap into those organizations and value their input and have the resources to support them, that can be a really good way of sort of getting representation without each individual person of a community having to put in their time. So those are some components really on the planning level. There's also things just with regard to how much capacity people have for different issues. So something that is important is that climate change and adaptation needs to be emphasized as, this is a very important thing. We should plan for this specifically. But then also it is important to integrate planning for adaptation with these other concerns. And I think that's where we can get into these structures.
Great. Well, Kieren Rudge, this has been a really valuable discussion, and we're almost out of time. And I want to invite you to, if you have like what you would tell our listeners in terms of how they can play a role in helping there be more justice in our adaptations to climate, and thank you so much for coming on the program.
Well, I'll just say, I think the big take-home point that I try to communicate is that climate change is not an isolated issue. And particularly if we care about justice and we care about equality, which I think most of us do, we have to think about the intersecting issues. So we need to be organizing and talking about these intersections between addressing climate change, but also addressing the need for more constitutional protections for people, the need for more equitable democracy, things like addressing gerrymandering, for example. So we really need to think about not just climate, but also political decision making, legal structures, and we can generate activism that cuts across all these different issues and really tries to unite coalitions.
Thank you. Really appreciate your comments, and that's a great message to close on.